Ever wonder about the stories hidden in plain sight? In a world that values flashy headlines and loud voices, some of the most profound acts of courage happen in silence. We often judge a book by its cover. But what if that cover, faded and worn, holds a story that saved a dozen lives? Meet Linda Harris, a woman whose quiet demeanor in old, worn-out uniform made her an easy target for ridicule. But what the young soldiers who laughed at her didn't know was that every frayed thread and faded patch on that uniform had a story to tell. A story of classified missions, strategic brilliance, and the silent weight of a hero who never asked for a spotlight. This is the story of a hero you've never heard of, a reminder that the loudest respect is sometimes earned by the quietest acts of service. She stepped into the base commissary wearing a uniform that had long outlived its prime. The deep blue had faded to a weary gray, the sleeves frayed, the patches hanging by stubborn threads. A few young officers lingering near the produce section noticed her immediately. One of them let out a quiet laugh and another muttered under his breath, "Looks like something from a thrift store costume rack." Their words floated toward her, sharp in their carelessness, but she didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She simply reached for a can of soup, placed it in her basket, and continued down the aisle in silence. They couldn't possibly have known. That weathered patch on her shoulder, dismissed now as little more than scrap fabric, had once opened doors that required clearances most of them would never even dream of. Behind those doors were maps that pointed to cities that didn't exist on paper, rooms where the air itself felt heavier, with secrets too classified to breathe. Linda Harris, age 56, lived in a quiet two-bedroom house on Maple Street, just outside a small military town in Nevada. Her neighbors, mostly young couples chasing the rhythm of promotions and new babies, only knew her as the woman who kept to herself. Every week she made the same trip to the base commissary, wearing that same old Air Force uniform. It wasn't about nostalgia, and it wasn't vanity. It was simple necessity. Her retirement check stretched thin, and the uniform was one of the few outfits in her closet that still fit comfortably after years of modest living. The fabric, softened by decades of washes, bore the weight of memories. Every seam, every polished button, still carried a whisper of the discipline that had once been second nature. And though the edges of the patches were worn and curling, she had never let a single crease go unpressed. No one there could have guessed that this very uniform had stood inside the Pentagon, had brushed past walls humming with classy outpost intelligence, had been present during the planning of Operation Halloween, a rescue mission so secret its name was barely spoken, even by those involved. Around the commissary, she had become a familiar sight. Some called her Auntie when they were feeling playful, or the outdated one when they thought she couldn't hear. Most assumed she was a widow clinging to her spouse's benefits, an aging dependent with nowhere else to belong. The truth of her past was invisible, buried under the anonymity of time. Near the checkout lanes, a small group of young airmen gathered every week, leaning against counters, thumbs flying across phone screens as they whispered to each other. When Linda approached with her groceries, always the same staples, bread, canned soup, the cheapest essentials she could afford, they smirked and traded jokes. "Is it Halloween already?" one had whispered last week, just loud enough for the words to sting. "Guess she thinks today's a costume party," another chimed in, grinning. Linda never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. Her face remained calm, composed, the way it had been in 100 tense briefings where lives depended on her clarity. But as she picked up a loaf of bread and placed it in her cart, her hands trembled just slightly. Her mind was already elsewhere, in a desert halfway around the world, 27 years ago, staring into the faces of 12 young men who had trusted her completely. Operators barely older than these airmen, who had listened to her outline extraction routes with wet, focused eyes, knowing that her plan was the line between their lives and the silence of the battlefield. Those faces, those memories, would never make it into public history books. They lived only in the sealed files of the Pentagon and in the private corridors of her mind. At the register, a teenage cashier with neon pink nails barely glanced up. "Military discount?" she asked, voice flat, not bothering to check Linda's ID, not offering a "thank you for your service." "Yes, please," Linda said softly, her tone steady and dignified. Decades of quiet strength were wrapped in those two simple words. She left with a single paper bag, the sum of her week's groceries, and passed a wall of glossy photographs by the exit. Bold letters above them read, "Heroes of our base." Rows of smiling young faces stared back. Fresh uniforms, recent deployments, public missions that could be safely celebrated. Linda's photo had never been on that wall. It never would be. The work that had defined her life would remain sealed for another 30 years, invisible to the world she had served. In the parking lot, she settled into the driver's seat of her aging Honda Civic and paused before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the base unfolded with its usual rhythm, families loading strollers, soldiers in crisp uniforms striding between buildings, the bright pulse of a life she had once been part of, now moving on without her. On an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Linda Harris pushed through the sliding doors of the base commissary for her usual weekly shopping trip. The doors hissed open with a familiar whoosh, releasing her into a room soaked in fluorescent light and the sharp tang of industrial cleaner mixed with the faint smell of packaged food. She paused for just a moment, adjusting to the bustle. The commissary was unusually crowded. A cluster of young airmen loitered near the magazine rack, their easy laughter bouncing off the walls. The supply sergeant on duty, a gray-haired man with a kindly face, nodded at her as she passed. He recognized her as a regular, always quiet, always alone. But like most people on this base now, he had no idea who she really was or what she had once done. Linda's worn combat boots clicked softly against the polished tile as she made her way down the aisles. Her movements were careful and deliberate, the steady rhythm of someone used to routine. She selected her usual staples: a can of chicken soup, a loaf of white bread, a small jar of peanut butter. Every choice was measured, the kind of calculation that came with living on a fixed income. Reaching for a box of crackers on the top shelf, her sleeve slid up just enough to reveal a glimpse of a faded tattoo along her wrist, a string of coordinates marking a place that had never appeared on any civilian map. "Excuse me, ma'am." Linda turned. A young airman stood behind her, curiosity and amusement flickering across his face. His name tag read Morrison. His uniform was crisp, the kind worn by someone who had never spent a night on cold ground or seen the dust of deployment settle into its seams. "Who authorized you to wear that uniform in here?" Morrison asked, raising his voice so his friends could hear. Linda's answer came steady, calm, almost quiet. "My old chain of command." The words only seemed to fuel his amusement. "Your old chain of command? What unit was that exactly?" Behind him, his friends leaned in, sensing a show. One of them, a young woman with immaculate hair and perfectly polished nails, lifted her phone, clearly ready to record something for later entertainment. "I served in Air Force Special Operations," Linda said, her voice free of anger or defense, simply stating a fact. The group erupted in laughter. "Special Operations?" Morrison repeated with a mock grin. "Ma'am, no offense, but you look more like somebody's grandma than any operator I've ever seen." Linda said nothing. She turned back to the shelf, lifted the crackers, and placed them gently into her cart. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the sheer effort of holding herself together. Every mocking word struck like a pin, poking through layers of silence she had carried for years, pressing against memories sealed under classification. She thought of the briefing rooms she had once sat in, rooms where no one dared speak to her the way these children did now. She remembered the lonely weight of being the only woman in spaces where choices were made that saved lives, stopped crises before the world ever knew they had been close. "You know what I think?" Morrison went on, bolder now with his small audience. "I think you got that uniform from a surplus store. Bet you're just here for the military discount on your cat food." The female airman laughed. "Should we call security? Isn't pretending to be military illegal?" "Relax, Sarah," another young man said with a smirk. "She's harmless. Just some old lady playing dress-up." Linda kept walking, cartwheels whispering over the tiles. The young airman followed, tossing words like pebbles, each one sharper than it should have been. To them, she was just a novelty, a story to share, maybe a clip to upload for a cheap laugh. By the time she reached the checkout counter, the small group had clustered behind her. The cashier, a young woman with a perpetually bored expression, scanned Linda's items without much interest. but she couldn't help glancing past Linda at the airmen lingering behind her. "Everything all right here?" the cashier asked finally, more curious than alarmed. "Just wondering about dress codes," Morrison said with a smug grin. "Seems like anyone can wear a uniform these days." Linda Harris reached into the pocket of her faded jacket, fingers brushing against the smooth, time-worn surface of her military ID. Years of use had dulled the plastic, but the weight of it still carried the authority of her past life. She slid it out carefully, and as she did, something small and stiff slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft tap. A triangular patch, dark green with a sharp gold triangle at its center, its edge circled by text so tiny it was almost invisible unless you knew where to look. But for those who did, those who could read the world between the letters, the real story wasn't in the design at all. It was in the thin line of embossed numbers and letters running along the bottom, a cryptic sequence that hadn't officially existed since the late 90s. Airman Morrison bent down and scooped up the patch, turning it over in his hand with a smirk. His eyes flicked over the triangle without recognition. He didn't know what he was holding. He couldn't. "What's this supposed to be?" he said, his voice thick with mockery. "Some kind of made-up squadron?" Linda's expression didn't change, but her tone shifted, low and level, the way it had back when she gave orders to men twice his size. A quiet authority slid into her words. "You can keep that, if you'd like," she said evenly. "I have others." She finished her transaction without another word, sliding exact change across the counter. The cashier barely glanced at her, already shifting attention to the next customer. Linda took her receipt, pocketed her ID, and turned toward the glass doors. Behind her, Morrison snorted. "Did you see how serious she was? I'm definitely posting this later." "Wait till the guys see this. Poor old lady probably has dementia or something." Laughter rippled from the small knot of young airmen. Linda didn't turn around. She stepped into the Nevada sunlight, letting the warmth settle over her face for a moment as she made her way toward her car. Each step was slow, deliberate, the kind that came from a lifetime of discipline. Through the reflection on the commissary doors, she caught a glimpse of Morrison holding the patch aloft, showing it off to his friends. They were still laughing, still blind to what sat in the palm of his hand. None of them noticed the black SUV that eased into the lot, sunlight flashing across its government plates. None of them saw the man in khaki pants and a crisp, untucked button-down step out, with the steady, purposeful stride of someone who never lost the habit of marching. The SUV's engine ticked as it cooled, cutting through the dry afternoon quiet. Sergeant First Class Raymond Knox had just arrived on base. After 23 years of service and a recent reassignment from the Pentagon, he'd been promised this new posting in Nevada would be quiet, administrative work, a gentle landing after decades of exemplary duty. But the second he stepped into the commissary, that promise shattered. He noticed the cluster of young airmen first, gathered like kids around a joke only they understood. Something passed from hand to hand. They were laughing, loose-shouldered, the way people are when they think the world is simple. Knox approached, casual but alert. "What's all the excitement?" he asked. Airman Morrison turned, still grinning. "Oh, just some old lady pretending she's military. Had this weird patch and everything. Sarah even got it on a video." Knox's expression didn't change, but a cold thread of instinct ran through him. "What kind of patch?" he said evenly. "Some made-up squadron thing, dark green with a triangle." Morrison held it up between two fingers, casual, careless. "Probably bought it at a flea market or something." The moment Knox's eyes landed on the patch, his stomach dropped. Dark green, gold triangle, the tiny line of numbers and letters along the bottom. His blood went cold. OPHW 98, Operation Hollow Wind, 1998. A mission that officially had never happened. And yet, standing here in the fluorescent light of a Nevada commissary, the ghost of that buried operation had just fallen into his hands. Back then, he had been just a staff sergeant, assigned to the intelligence support team of a rescue mission so sensitive that every single person involved had signed non-disclosure agreements meant to follow them to the grave. The strategic mind behind that mission, a mission that should have been a death sentence, was an Air Force captain named Linda Harris. Her tactical genius had turned what everyone expected to be a hopeless operation into a miracle, bringing 12 Special Forces operators home alive from a country the United States wasn't even supposed to be in. Inside the commissary, Knox's voice dropped to a whisper, almost reverent. "Where is she?" "Who?" Morrison asked, still smirking, thinking Knox was overreacting. "The woman wearing this patch. Where did she go?" Knox held up the patch he'd just retrieved, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Morrison jerked a thumb toward the parking lot. "Just left. Why, you know her or something?" But Knox was already moving, striding toward the exit, clutching the patch as though it were a sacred relic. Through the glass doors, he spotted her, an older woman in a faded uniform, walking slowly toward a battered Honda Civic. Her back was to him, but after nearly 25 years, he still knew her. It was in the way she held herself, shoulders square, her steps measured and precise, the same posture that had once carried her through the most secure corridors on Earth. "Ma'am!" Knox called out, pushing through the doors. Linda Harris turned at the sound. Her expression was guarded, almost cautious, the kind of careful mask worn by someone who'd learned that attention usually meant trouble. Knox slowed his approach, keeping his eyes locked on hers. "Ma'am, are you Linda Harris? Captain Harris, from Operation Hollow Wind?" His voice trembled at the end, the question hanging in the air like a live wire. Her face didn't change, but Knox saw it. The almost invisible shift in posture, that unconscious straightening of the spine that came from years of military bearing, never fully forgotten. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone deliberate, careful. "I don't know what you're talking about." Knox understood immediately. After all these years, the operation was still classified. She couldn't acknowledge it outright, but there were other ways. "Ma'am, the extraction point was Victor 7. Primary route compromised at 0347 hours. You recommended the Northern Corridor as the alternate." For just a fraction of a second, Linda's eyes widened. Those exact details had never been written in any official report. Only someone who had been there, someone who had lived it, could know. "Sergeant Knox," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. Before he even realized what he was doing, Knox dropped to one knee right there in the commissary parking lot. Head bowed, his voice ringing out with a clarity that carried into the warm afternoon air. "Captain Harris, ma'am, it's an honor." Through the commissary windows, the scene froze everyone in place. Shoppers and clerks alike stared in stunned silence. Morrison and his friends had followed Knox outside, expecting to see him expose Linda as a fraud. Instead, they were staring at something they couldn't quite understand, something instinctively sacred. "Sergeant, please stand up," Linda said quietly, almost pleading. But Knox didn't move. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Ma'am, because of your planning, 12 operators came home. 12 families got their sons and husbands back. We were told we'd never get the chance to thank you properly." By now, people were emerging from nearby buildings, drawn to the unusual sight. The commissary had practically emptied. A small crowd gathered in the parking lot, murmuring, I don't get it," Morrison whispered to Sarah, his usual confidence gone. "Who is she?" From the commissary entrance, the older supply sergeant finally stepped forward, his voice rough but certain. "Son, that woman you were laughing at? She's the reason some of your brothers in arms are still breathing." Knox rose to his feet at last, but his posture snapped to attention, rigid and formal. "Ma'am, your service, what you did, it mattered. It still matters." For years, Linda Harris had carried herself with quiet composure, enduring the slow erosion of recognition, the weight of living in the shadows. In that moment, under the afternoon sun and the silent gaze of the crowd, a piece of that invisible burden seemed to lift. At last, Linda's composure broke. A single tear slid down her weathered cheek, not from sorrow, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of finally being seen. After all these years of carrying her history in silence, someone had remembered. Her voice was low and rough as she whispered, "Thank you, Sergeant." Morrison stepped forward, the mission patch still clenched in his hand. Gone was the cocky air again from before him. Now his posture sagged under the weight of shame and something that might have been awe. "Ma'am," his voice faltered. He extended the patch with unsteady hands. "I'm sorry, we didn't know." Linda accepted the patch carefully, her fingers brushing over the familiar, worn fabric as if greeting an old friend. "You couldn't have known," she said gently. "That was the point." Around them, the small crowd stood in a hush so deep it seemed to swallow the commissary. They weren't just onlookers anymore. They understood. They were witnessing the rarest kind of moment, the instant when hidden valor finally steps into the light. Not because the one who bore it asked for recognition, but because someone at last understood its true weight. A week later, Linda's phone rang with an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, steady. "Captain Harris, this is Sergeant Knox. I was wondering, would you join us for a small memorial gathering at the base?" He hurried to add, "Nothing public, just a few people who understand what your service meant." Linda hesitated. After decades spent living in the shadows, she had grown wary of attention, even the respectful kind, but there was something in Knox's voice, a quiet West reverence she hadn't heard directed at her in years, that nudged her past her caution. "All right," she said finally. The gathering was small and intimate, held in a modest conference room in the base's administrative building. There were no cameras, no speeches, no official notices. Only 23 people sat waiting, men and women who had either served with Linda or who understood the significance of Operation Hollow Wind. When she entered wearing her old uniform, carefully pressed, the same faded one that had carried her through that mission, but now treated with the respect it deserved, the entire room rose to its feet. It wasn't the casual, automatic rising that came with military protocol. It was slower, deeper, the kind of standing that carried silent acknowledgement of sacrifice, something beyond the rulebook. Sergeant Knox approached her carrying a small wooden box. His hand shook as he offered it to her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "this came from the Pentagon archives. Someone there decided it was time." Inside the box lay a patch. Not just any patch, her Operation Hollow Wind patch. The original one, the very piece of cloth that had been stripped from her uniform when the mission went classified. It had been cleaned, preserved, and restored to how it must have looked 25 years ago. The fabric no longer faded, the gold triangle shining as if newly sewn. Along the bottom edge, where the old classification markings once hid it from history, was a simple inscription. "Service above self, 1938. Linda lifted the patch with trembling fingers. For a heartbeat, she was no longer standing in that small conference room, but back in the briefing chamber all those years ago. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest, hear the quiet voices of her 12 team members whose lives had balanced on her decisions, and remember the fierce, clear satisfaction of bringing every single one of them home. "There's something else," Knox said softly. From the side of the room, a young woman stepped forward. Linda recognized her instantly, the commissary cashier who had once rung up her groceries with bored indifference. But her face now was transformed by nervous respect. She carried a simple thermos, warm to the touch. "Ma'am," she said, her voice unsteady, I wanted to apologize and to thank you. My brother deployed last year, and knowing that people like you were out there, looking out for people like him." Her voice broke. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Linda understood. Near the back, Morrison lingered in his uniform, looking smaller than before, almost boyish in his uncertainty. He took a tentative step forward. "Ma'am," he said, swallowing hard, "I deleted the video, and I wanted to ask you something." He hesitated, gathering courage. Would you be willing to talk to some of the younger airmen about service, about what it really means?" Linda glanced around the quiet room at the faces, some young, some weathered by years, watching her with something stronger than respect. They were united in a rare understanding, that true duty lived in the spaces where no one was watching. She felt the weight of the patch in her hand, warm against her palm, as if the fabric itself carried a hidden memory of every unspoken story. "About this?" asked a female sergeant sitting near the back of the room. Linda Harris's reply came slowly, drawn from decades of silent service and the kind of wisdom you only earn the hard way. Her voice carried a calm weight when she finally said, "Because honor doesn't need an audience. Real service happens in the space between recognition and necessity." The young sergeant scribbled the words on a scrap of paper, her brow furrowed in thought. Later, she would have those words printed and hung in her unit's break room, where they would spark quiet debates about the difference between chasing glory and living with purpose. As the gathering came to a close, people approached Linda one by one. No one asked for selfies or autographs. Instead, they leaned in for hushed conversations about service, about sacrifice, about the crushing burden of carrying secrets that mattered. That evening, when Linda finally left the base, she carried more than the restored patch they had given her. She carried something she hadn't felt in decades, the quiet knowledge that her service had been seen, acknowledged, and valued. Her faded uniform looked exactly the same as it had the week before, but everything inside her had changed. In the modern world, people make snap judgments with their eyes, especially in military life, where appearances often define perception. Yet sometimes the most extraordinary stories belong to the quietest souls. Linda Harris had become a living emblem, not because she'd fought the loudest battles, but because she understood what it meant to fight the invisible ones. The lesson was simple, one Morrison would never forget. Never laugh at the worn spots on a soldier's uniform, because you don't know who those worn threads once protected. 3 months after that day in the commissary, an official letter arrived in Linda's mailbox. The Department of Defense was declassifying portions of Operation Hollow Wind. At last, her name could be publicly linked to the mission that had defined her career. They offered her a ceremony, medals, a formal presentation, even press coverage. Linda turned it down. Over coffee with Knox, she explained her decision in the same plain-spoken way she lived her life. Some service was never meant for spotlights. Instead, she kept her routines. Each week, she drove her old Honda Civic to the commissary in the same sun-faded uniform. But now the looks were different. Young airmen nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even approached to shake her hand, thanking her for clearing paths they were just beginning to walk. Morrison, the young airman who had once mocked her, became one of her most loyal defenders. Before every deployment, he started a unit tradition. His team would visit Linda, not for luck, not for blessing, for perspective. She taught us, Morrison told every new recruit, that the most important battles are the ones no one knows you fought. Even the commissary cashier, Sarah, the young woman who had first witnessed the incident, eventually enlisted. She credited Linda's quiet dignity as the moment she understood that wearing a uniform wasn't about how it looked on the outside, but about the weight you carried inside. Linda's story traveled through military circles in the way that mattered most, not through headlines or viral posts, but through the timeless rhythm of word of mouth. Stories told over mugs of bitter coffee, lessons whispered from sergeant to private, wisdom passed along by those who had spent decades serving in silence. Veterans groups invited her to speak at public events. She always declined, but she would quietly accept invitations to visit wounded warriors in hospitals, to sit beside grieving families who had lost sons and daughters in service to classified missions they would never be allowed to discuss. "The uniform doesn't make you special," Linda would say gently to young soldiers. "What you do while wearing it does." Her old Honda became a familiar sight in base parking lots across Nevada. Whenever young service members needed a reminder of what duty truly meant, Linda would appear, not as a hero chasing recognition, but as a living embodiment of the truth that the most profound acts of courage are often performed in silence. Years rolled by. When Linda Harris passed away at 78, her funeral drew hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Among them was Morrison, now a senior NCO. He approached her casket, placed the restored Operation Hollow Wind patch atop it, and offered the salute that had come to define her legacy. Some salutes, though silent, carry more weight than any words ever could.